There it goes. Okay. All right. So our opening here was that I did ask you to go ahead and open up the new article on Common Lit and start reading that so that you can answer question 1 while we were getting started. I will be posting for you guys the slide information from today's lesson because today we're going to do a little bit of reteaching instead of doing a full activity like we normally do when we start off with a new article on Common Lit. Okay, so let me just make sure yours posted properly because I thought I moved it. Nope, it's not there. So let me go ahead and make sure that yours pops out. I thought I did that when I did first period successfully. Maybe I didn't. What did we end up doing? Oh, we had to push it out, right? Okay. So re-push that out. It would have been available to you on Common Lit. It just wouldn't transfer it over into your thingy, your Google Classrooms. And there it is. All right, good. All right, so it might be at the top of your page at the moment, but I'm going to go ahead and move that right now on the master page down into week 2 of quarter 2 so that you can find it more easily. It's not just floating around in the moho zone there. All right. So today's story is The Danger of a Single Story. And we are still going to be using our notice and note strategies with it. However, Miss Narduzzi and I sat for about a day and a half going, like, trying to figure out what we could do to help you all to better understand what we're doing, because our previous exit tickets and experiences show that there are still well over half of the class struggling with this, that they really are just kind of like they understand a little bit, but they're feeling lost or they're feeling frustrated, or this is still very much a difficult task. And the idea here is that this is actually supposed to help you guys be able to read a little bit more critically and think about what you're reading as you're reading it, as opposed to just waiting until after you're done reading it. So the idea is that many of us were not really ever sat down and taught this is how to annotate. For the most part, if you're anything like me, what happened was you got to a certain point in your academic career, whether that is your sophomore or junior year, and people were like, oh, here, annotate this. And you're like, what does that mean? They're like, just write notes in the margins. And I, when I was doing that, it was like, okay. And I'm sitting there like drawing like pictures of what's going on. But summary and summarizing is not really what annotation is. Annotation is supposed to be, I've thought about this critically, and I'm making a note about something that I'm thinking about right now while I'm reading this that is not a summary of the text, but rather some connection that I'm making, some thing that I think that this might be used for, or an explanation of what I think this thing that I've noticed here is doing. So when we're doing notice and note, the whole purpose of this is that we are learning how to recognize when the text is showing us something. Okay, that's what the different notice things are for. And then we are learning how to write an annotation that we can use later on that would help us to write things like a short answer response, or something bigger like a literary Oh my God, words. Uh, what do we call it when we write an essay and we explain what a story's doing? Miss Narduzzi, help my brain. Analysis. There it is. A literary analysis. Uh, so I don't know if I'm starting to suffer from aphasia or not. Aphasia is a fancy word for when you know the word, you just can't remember what the word is. So with that bearing in mind, I will hopefully remember all of the words as we go through our updated reteach here. So basically what it came down to is Miss Narduzzi and I decided that maybe what it is we're not going in small enough steps. So think of it this way. If I did the recipe and now I'm thinking I should have put that GIF in there. Oh, I'm not sure if anybody has seen the TV show Schitt's Creek, but there's like a scene where David's mom is trying to teach him how to make something. And she's like, okay, the next step in the recipe says fold in the cheese. And he's like, okay, but how do you fold in the cheese? What does that mean? And she's like, it just says fold in the cheese. And then they argue back and forth because the instructions tell them to do something that neither one of them really understands how to do. So we decided that maybe that's what we were doing with our instructions is we were leaving something out. We were asking you to fold in the cheese, but not explaining to you what folding in meant. So in this case, what we did is we took a step back and we said, okay, let's look at the format of this. What are we assuming that everybody understands that they're not? So we left the notice things up here correct. They are still the same. So the things that we want you to see in the text or to be looking for in the text are still the same. But then we changed our ask and we changed the ask to think because really what you're supposed to be doing is thinking to yourself about what it is that you just noticed. Okay. So I found a piece of evidence. I'm going to think about this piece of evidence. Is this evidence something that I should pick up and put into my little evidence baggie? Okay. So think about as you're looking at that piece of evidence and highlighting it. For example, if it's a contrast and contradiction, think about why do these differences or similarities matter? What is the author trying to do with this difference and similarity? Are they trying to explain an idea in a way that makes it more friendly to me or understandable to me? Are they trying to persuade me in some way? Or are they trying to show me something new by comparing it to something that I already know? What are they trying to do with this? And the whole point here is that now that I've analyzed it and thought about it clearly, now I can go in and write. So I'm going to see something, I'm going to think about something, and then I'm going to say something. So I'm going to now write my annotation. So my annotation should answer the question or it should explain how this evidence shows the author's purpose for contrast and contradiction, or how this evidence is used to support the author's claim or their controlling idea. Okay, so it's going to do one of the two things. It's either going to help me to understand their purpose for writing. Are they trying to inform me? Are they trying to entertain me? Are they trying to persuade me? Or that what they are trying to present to me, what claim or controlling idea they're trying to share, whether they're trying to persuade me or they're trying to inform me. I need to be able to explain how they're trying to do these things. So remember, the goal is that we can cite strong evidence, but the whole point of citing the evidence is that we can prove what is the author's purpose or what is their central idea or claim. So our first example comes from the very beginning of the article that you're going to be reading. So Adichie, and I would say her first name, but I'm pretty sure that I pronounce it wrong, and I don't like doing that because I feel like it's disrespectful to mispronounce somebody's name, especially when you do it repeatedly. And some people do it on purpose, which is really quite rude. You see that a lot with like politics, where they will purposely mispronounce somebody's name in order to show them disrespect. Um, and that's on both sides, not just like conservatives or Democrats. They both do it. Um, so I do know how to pronounce her last name, Adichie. She's a novelist and a nonfiction writer. She pretty much just writes all the time. I do believe she is also a professor of writing. She is a Nigerian woman, uh, and Nigeria, in case anybody isn't aware, is a country on the continent of Africa. And this is where some of us are going to have the mind blowing moment that Africa is a continent, not a country. And that's okay, because there's a lot of people who don't know that. So the piece I highlighted is in the first paragraph. I'm going to go ahead and read on the first two paragraphs and then go back to the part that I highlighted. And I'm going to point out to you that I really didn't key in on that thing that I highlighted until I probably finished like the first paragraph or two to go, I was thinking about it. I'm like, that's kind of a contrast and contradiction without really being an obvious one. Okay, so she says, I'm a storyteller, and I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I grew up in a university campus in East Nigeria. My mother says I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer, and when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kind of stories I was reading. All of my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow, they ate apples, and they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had finally come out. So I started thinking about this. I was like, there is a contrast and contradiction here in the beginning. And that contrast is between my xenophobic assumptions as an American about the rest of the world. In America, whenever we're shown any kind of images out of Africa, typically if we see them, they're going to be on our news or they're going to be in commercials. They're going to be in commercials for things like support the children or save the children. And we're shown impoverished, uneducated people living in what can only be described as huts, implying that they're not educated, that they're not, that they don't have a lot of resources, that they need the Western white saviors to come in and help them. Okay. And send them their money to help them dig wells and things like that. Or we're shown pictures of, people in, in the throes of war and conflict. For example, you might see like the militias driving around in their trucks trying to enforce things and things like that. So we're shown images of one of two things, either extreme poverty or extreme violence. And those are the two images that were usually shown out of countries in Africa. And that's pretty much about it, because America likes to focus on American stories. No other way to put it. When you guys sit down to watch the evening news, 9 times out of 10, all you're going to see is local news. If you watch the news that comes on after it, the national news, you'll see national news and maybe one or two stories about what's going on in the world. But you actually, as an American citizen, have to take the time to search out world events, I guess, world news events, to know what's going on in the Middle East or in China or Korea or South Korea or Thailand Taiwan or New Zealand and things like that. Um, Otherwise, our media isn't going to share those stories with you because they don't think that Americans are particularly interested in it. So the contrast I put here is that those images make me, as a typical American citizen, believe that there aren't things in Nigeria like universities. So I might be like, oh, you grew up on a university? That seems very odd to me. And I say that because I have had students who are exchange students who came from Nigeria, in Zanzibar and a few other places in that general same area of Africa. Um, and people are often, especially students, when they get up to share their culture with everybody, surprised to learn that they have schools and they live in real houses and they come from actual cities and things like that. Because we are fed this very narrow view of what it's like to live in a country in Africa. So I highlighted where she says, I grew up on a university campus in Eastern Nigeria, because these are images that we don't usually put together. A university campus and Nigeria. So I said this sets up a contrast for my annotation here, because remember, my goal is that I am going to be answering what is the central idea, or I'm going to be saying what is the author's purpose here. So with this, I felt like she was setting up the central idea a little bit more. So her central idea, or her main idea, I said, was that a narrow view of the world is built when we do not read stories that reflect many different cultures and experiences. So for my annotation, remember, my job is not just to say this is the killer and here is the evidence, but to explain how the evidence proves it. So I said this sets up a contrast between the American assumption that Africa is not civilized, yet it is a continent full of developed nations like Nigeria. This evidence is used to show her main idea that a narrow view of the world is built when we do not read stories that reflect many different cultures and experiences. I could probably go a step further with this, but the box would be ginormous, and explain that assuming that in Nigeria they don't have things like universities or colleges, is an example of how not reading stories from Nigeria or about Nigeria has narrowed my own personal view. So any questions about this annotation before we move on? I know it's super entertaining to watch me talk all day. I feel like I should set up a webcam if I can find my webcam and just put it on my cat so you can see how when I do my extended screen on my TV, the laser pointer thing drives my cat nuts. He's literally sitting in front of the TV right now watching it, about to attack. All right. So let's look at extreme or absolute language. We took a little brain break there and talked about Thackeray Binks, the evil kitty. So for extreme or absolute language, we again went in and changed that ask to a think about. And you'll notice I even, like, y'all should be very impressed by this, I know. I was able to change the bullet point here to a thought bubble instead of a speech bubble. So you're going to think about, why is this writer using this type of language? What type of appeal are they trying to make with the language? And so on. Because our goal is that you're going to be able to write about how this evidence shows the author's purpose for their writing, or how the evidence shows, or is used to present the central idea or the claim. So again, I've seen something, I've taken notice that they're using extreme language. I've thought about it. All right, I've used my thought questions here. And now I'm going to write about it. Okay. So on Tuesday, we introduced quoted words. And I did tell you guys that that's probably the easiest one to notice because quoted words are already in quotation marks for us typically. So when I notice somebody is being quoted, the first thing I need to do as I'm looking at this is think about, why is this person who is being quoted important enough to be quoted in the first place? Why did they pick this person? Why does the author think the reader needs to know what this person has to say? And how does this quote add to the argument? Thinking about these things is going to allow me to be able to better answer things like, how does the author develop their ideas with this piece of evidence? Or what does this evidence do to support their claim? I'm sorry, Angel. I didn't mean to make your kitty cat go nuts, or mine. I'm pretty sure mine's going to end up scratching our TV screen, and my husband's going to lose his mind because an order of importance in his life of the things that he covets the most, his TV is number one, his Xbox is number two, and then there's like the rest of us. All right. And I know all my gamers are like, well, I don't know if I would put TV above the game system, but all right. So our last one that we introduced was the rhetorical devices. Again, if you need support on those rhetorical devices, because when I say things like repetition, simile, or metaphor and allusion, you're like, what? What did she just say? I don't know those words. I invite you to please go and complete the ed puzzle that was assigned for you guys on Monday, because that reviewed those pieces for you. When we take notice that somebody is using something that we recognize as a rhetorical device of, what we're going to stop to do and think about is, what kind of appeal are they using this rhetorical device to try to make here? Is it a logical appeal, a logos? Is it an ethical appeal, an ethos, where they're trying to show me that they are an expert or they are somebody that I should trust about this? Or that they're trying to show me that this is like a determination of right versus wrong.
Expert?
What's that?
They trying to say that they're expert at it?
Yeah. So when it's an ethical appeal, they're either trying to show you that they're an expert or that this is like a case of right versus wrong and that there's like no middle ground. Okay. And then finally, the pathos, which is your emotional appeal. And somebody always usually asks me, like, why does logos sounds like logical and ethos sounds a lot like ethical, but pathos doesn't sound anything like emotional? So I just try to remember that pathos, like all of these are Latin words. And for some reason, we kept logic and ethics very close to their original words, but emotions we moved away from, except for in the word pathological, or what is the other one I was going to think of? Yeah, so like if somebody's a pathological liar, it means they have no feelings about lying to you whatsoever. Like they actually kind of enjoy it. So yeah, that's where I usually like show you that the word is still used to talk about emotions, but just not as much. So then you want to think about, what do they want the reader to think about or do? So what do they want me to think? Do they want me to think that they're like the greatest person in the world to go to for this advice, even though they're a doctor who has prayed it out to tell us that we are all like the products of aliens? Or are they somebody that is supposed to help me to make an emotional connection to the story, to believe that this story should matter to me because it is hurting somebody? And does this type of appeal work or not? There's a reason when we see Dr. Fauci speaking, they always talk about the fact that all of his the research that he's done in the past. They're trying to show us that he is an expert and we should listen to him. All right. So we've seen something, we've thought about that something, now we have to write something. So again, we're going to try to explain or answer questions like, how does the author develop their ideas? And what evidence did they use to support their claim? So my second example is from paragraph 10. So that's why I said try to answer question 1 while I was talking, so that you can get into that part to be able to highlight it. So this comes from a little bit further down in the story. And she says, she's talking about, still talking about the fact that, she only read these stories that were British or American. So like in my head, she's a little kid reading Harry Potter, though at the time she wouldn't have been, because that story would not have been written yet. But in my imagination, that's the kind of connection I made, is that she's reading something like Harry Potter, or I believe Rick Riordan is American, and he writes I'm gonna have to look that up before I go any further. Yeah. Okay. Well, all right. So, Kamari, I'm not entirely sure. You mean you thought ethos meant that they always lied and showed a pattern, or the pathical liar thing? I mean, it's typically a pattern of lies, but a pathological liar is somebody who it's as if they are using those lies to put up a wall between their actual feelings and the truth. But typically, a person who is a pathological liar is also likely a sociopath. So it's not that they don't have emotions, they have their own emotions. They just don't understand that other people have emotions, or they think that other people's emotions don't matter. Yeah, oof. And those are people who usually start toxic relationships. Yes, Rick Riordan, I am right. I had to look him up real quick, is an American author. And Rick Riordan is the guy who wrote the Percy Jackson series and the Olympians, um, and all of those books. He also does some detective mysteries, which you probably have never heard of, like I think it's Half Moon Detective Agency, but things like that. But you guys probably know him for the Percy Jackson books, because I'm sure that those were available to all of you at the Scholastic Book Fair. You guys remember the Scholastic Book Fair? It's a lovely place. All right. So she talks about how she says, I loved American and British books that I had read. They stirred my imagination and they opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I didn't know that people like me could exist in literature. So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this: it saved me from having a single story of what books are. So I highlighted those first 3 sentences there. And the reason I highlighted them is because the last sentence includes a metaphor, but unfortunately, the way it's worded, without the context or the information that's included in those first 2 sentences, the last one doesn't make a lot of sense. So if I just said, they opened up new worlds for me, Angel, I'm sure in her head, just went and did the whole little thing for Doctor Strange, because that's what I would have done. And as if a portal had just opened up. But that's not what she's saying. She's not saying Doctor Strange came down and opened up a portal for us, right? She's talking about books. So we have to understand that the they she's talking about is not a person, it's not a character, it's the books themselves. And books cannot physically do anything. They are an inanimate object that just sits on a shelf until somebody else opens them up and reads them. Um, So they can't physically do that. So that's what makes this a metaphor, by saying that books open new worlds for you. And it's not even really worlds, right? They're just stories, new ideas. So I saw this, I highlighted it, then I thought about it. I thought about, what is this metaphor? What is she trying to do with this metaphor? What is she trying to show me? Okay. And then I wrote something. So I wrote down on my little annotation box that this is an example of a metaphor, and the metaphor is used to develop the main idea that a narrow view of the world is built when we do not read stories that reflect many different cultures and experiences. I could probably add to this one as well and explain the metaphor, but at the same time, that also implies that either I, who would be going back to reread it, would not remember what the metaphor meant, or that whoever is reading my response to it isn't quite smart enough to understand metaphors, which sometimes we have to make that assumption. Yeah, I like Doctor Strange. I didn't really like the comic books Doctor Strange. I do like the movie one better. I know that sounds kind of weird. I like Peter Quill in the comic books better than the one in the movies. They are two wholly different people, though. The Peter Quill of the or Star-Lord of the comic books is a lot more like Yondu was than he is like the Peter Quill of the movies. What? Really, Skylar? All right. So again, I will post these with your I will post these with the instructions so that you can get those annotations copied into your articles. But as a quick review, just remember, we color code so that it's easier for us to go back to identify where we saw the evidence that we want to use to answer a question or to respond to something, or if we are writing an essay to locate what it was that we had wanted to say previously. And the whole point is that we're highlighting so that we can cite strong textual evidence, and we annotate so that we can explain what the evidence is showing. All right. So with all of that said and done, hopefully everybody has a little bit better understanding of what's going on. I have a real quick exit ticket for you. If you have questions, you can stick around to ask them. But I would like you to fill out the exit ticket before you leave class. However, this is the end of our presentation for the day.